4 ideas to keep in mind as you think about space. The first is that we always start with the desired student learning outcome. Next, sometimes schools can actually fit a bigger school on a smaller campus if they get a little bit creative. Thirdly, we rarely get to start from scratch, so a lot of times we're figuring out how to take what we have as an existing school and make it work for our needs. And along those lines, something as simple as furniture can actually have a pretty big impact if used in creative ways.
We want to share the learnings of what our schools are finding. And the first piece of wisdom that they've shared is that we have to be incredibly clear about the desired outcome of learning and then build spaces or design spaces towards that outcome in mind. It's the architectural adage of let form follow function.
Exactly, and what that means is really start with the student experience in mind, design your blended learning model, figure out the culture that you want in place, and then design the facilities to meet those outcomes. Don't let you really make those facilities be a slave to that mission that you're trying to achieve, not the other way around, and just don't accept the 4 walls of the classroom with the teacher in front and the whiteboard as the given when you get into this work.
I think space gives you a sense of value. You know, when you walk into a classroom and you see tables all in a row, all facing one direction, that is where the energy and the flow will be, is towards the front of the board. When you walk into a space where furniture is facing each other, you can't see where the center is, all of a sudden then you must realize that the user is the center. And so in a lot of ways, being able to look at space can help you understand how aligned you are to the principles that you say that you're going to use.
So really, it's a question. You say to yourself, when do I want students working with the teacher directly? When do I want them working independently on a computer? When might I want them working in projects? It's that kind of questioning that lets you think about the ideal space.
Yeah, that's exactly right. So let's actually try to answer that with a station rotation model first. How would you start to set up that experience?
Perfect. So in a station rotation, we actually see schools don't need to actually change the architecture of their school that much. They might still want to have an area for direct instruction, but maybe it's got a smaller footprint in the classroom because generally they're working with fewer students in that direct instruction. And then there needs to be some separation generally, so there's a place for students to work kind of independently. Maybe it's more quiet, maybe there's less visual distractions for the students there, and then they need a space that's set up for good group work where the students can interact with each other and maybe be close to some supplies or be in a part of the room that won't disturb the others if they get a little louder.
And here's where it actually gets really fun, because as you think about those students working on computers in that one part of the space, do they need to be at desks typing away at computers, or can you create more flexible environments depending on their age or what they're trying to accomplish? For example, maybe they could be on beanbag chairs just looking through their tablets and reading material. Alternatively, you're at the project tables. Do they need to be desks just clumped together? Or can we create creative spaces or tables of different sorts that really optimize the type of learning that you want to see happen in that environment? You may also need to think about sightlines so that you can have one teacher in a room just quickly scan the entire room and know what all of the students are doing so that they're actually on task.
So let's say there's 3 different stations, and one station is small group work with the teacher, maybe with small whiteboards that the kids are working on. Another station is solo work on the computers, and a third station is groups of kids working together on some meatier project or problem where they're discussing and throwing ideas back and forth with each other. So in that situation, I would take each station one by one and say, so if you want kids to be able to do whiteboard work with you, what kind of furniture would you need? Or given the furniture you have, where, how would you put it? Where would you put it in your room? And teachers generally have a lot of good instinct about their own space, and so we just go with that as the initial try. When it comes to the kids working on solo computers, I recommend generally, particularly with the middle school kids, that orient the screen so that if you're over here working with the small group, that if you glance over there, you'll be able to see their screens.
So let's move beyond just the station rotation now. And when you start thinking about a space in these settings, maybe we can be a little more creative in how we use space.
So let's listen to our protagonists and their take on it first.
Our physical space here started as an empty office building in an industrial park in Sunnyvale. We blew out the walls, we blew out the ceiling, and we've made it a brightly lit, vibrant, colorful space that is open for student learning and should be adaptable. To make it adaptable, we've put all of our furniture on wheels so we can rapidly convert big open spaces into sectioned off areas if that's what the project focus demands.
And what we're finding is that schools they're realizing that in many cases they're going to want a much bigger space, more wide open, that really goes beyond a traditional classroom.
Michael, I almost think it's like my vision of the new normal is like a library of a college campus meets a Starbucks, where there's still academic learning and purpose, but maybe ability to have more informal or different kinds of spaces, and maybe even a place for a student to sit and have a beverage while they take a break from their learning.
To create larger spaces that are more flexible, we see a lot of people taking a lot of different tacks. So new classrooms, which emerged from New York City's School of One, works with school districts to actually come in and tear down the walls between groups of classrooms to create far more wide open learning spaces that can enable a greater variety of activities and many more teachers in the environment with students than would otherwise be possible.
And rocket ship education that we've been talking about used to use the lab rotational model, where students left the classroom and went to the lab, and they just are not as happy about the classroom talking to the lab and the lab talking to the classroom, so they're actually trying to pull the lab back in. And they've been experimenting with taking 3 classrooms and knocking out those 2 middle walls to say, what would it look like to make a large space that could fit up to 100 students, but maybe would have lots of different stations within the room for small group instruction, for independent computer work, for time with the teacher, and whether it's flexible walls or floating bookcases or ways to create that demarcation of space, but still have a really vibrant, exciting learning space that was flexible for their needs.
And you remember Carpe Diem, the blended learning school with locations in Arizona, Indianapolis, and Cincinnati. What's interesting is that in their Arizona school, when they initially started, they had a large central learning lab where students worked at their individual offices online, and then they had those breakout rooms around the perimeter that were glassed off and where students would do collaborative projects. But what they noticed was that when students were in the collaborative areas, working with other students and teachers, that they would get so energized from that collaborative activity that when it was time to rotate back into the learning lab, that energy would just pour out of the breakout environments into the central learning lab, and it would disrupt the learning in oftentimes. So what they did when they moved to the Indianapolis facility and opened that school there is that they actually put it on 2 different floors. So on the second floor was your learning lab, and on the first floor was your breakout rooms. And the reason they did that was that so there would be a cultural distinction about the first floor being the place for that noisy collaborative activity, and by the time you moved up the stairs to the second floor, it was time to be quiet and ready to focus on your individual work.
So Summit, Rocket Ship, and Carpe Diem all have one more thing in common, which is as they move beyond this old like egg crate model of architecture for schools, they're actually building schools with a smaller footprint, using less square footage, probably bringing down their cost to build the buildings and creating, frankly, a more environmentally friendly building because it's occupying less land.
Yeah, and so if you look at Carpe Diem in Arizona, actually, the traditional school building in that space would cost 2.5 times as much to build and would require twice as many classrooms.
And you think about repurposing existing space. When Summit was trying to create this big, more flexible learning environment, they actually decided to start with an old converted office building and create a really neat flexible space out of an office park. Now, we realize most of you are not going to be designing a brand new $40 million building. That's okay. You can still do a lot of these same ideas in whatever setting you're thinking about blended learning.
So we've seen some of these new workarounds already. For example, new classrooms helping districts tear down walls between classrooms to get larger spaces. But if you can't tear down a wall, just think about the larger spaces you already have in your school. Multi-purpose rooms, cafeterias, even folding walls that adjoin between different classrooms. There are a lot of opportunities.
And even just within a classroom, creating little nooks, or thinking about how KIPP LA used some hall room space to create another learning environment for their students. This spirit of creativity and hacking your space can lead to some really simple but creative uses of space and furniture for very different outcomes in schools.
So in our library, we've designed a portable to be an incredible reading space for our students. We have the students seating in quads, and all the books are displayed so the book cover is out. It looks like a colorful space. The students are able to transition from the old school sitting and reading a book to popping open an iPad and taking a cloud-based quiz.
We've also seen some examples in Milpitas, which is a school district in California. What they've done is that they looked around and said, where do we already have large learning spaces? And it turned out that they had them in their kindergarten classrooms. So what they did was relocated the kindergarten classrooms to smaller rooms and used those spaces for big learning labs for their lab rotation model that they implemented.
And also they got furniture right there and created different levels of heights and different kind of cool settings that really worked for those students.
Now we've labeled this last section, don't forget the furniture, but we're not just talking about the furniture. We're talking about all of the things that you decide to do that impact the learning environment that you create. So that ranges from the furniture to also how you decorate the walls and all those little touches in design that you put in.
And you know, it's easy to say, why are you talking about paint color, right? We get it. But the thing is, if you visit schools that don't get this right, and they think it's just about the tables or the kids on the computers, it can lack that heart, that emotional connection. We actually visited a school recently together, which looked beautiful. It was an historic building, but it was really dark, and they sort of went for history and gravitas rather than energy. And then they asked the students to work independently for a large portion of the day, and you could just feel it in the vibe of the students. There was something missing. It didn't have that pop. It didn't tell students with every decision, go for it, keep working, it's up to you, don't give up.
So don't think that your furniture has to be one size fits all, if you will. Not every desk has to be the same size or shape. Not every chair has to be arranged the exact same way. Be creative in the choices that you make to construct that ideal learning environment.
A couple things we've done is made racks of Chromebooks using simple supplies of an aluminum rack and plastic containers like you would see in a magazine rack. These are what hold the Chromebooks, and it's a built-in charging station. We've also taken a typical 4x4 IKEA cubby. We've put wheels on the bottom, whiteboard material on the back. These serve as both room dividers, learning spaces, and cubbies for student materials.
The Milpitas district here in California is actually a great example of that sort of creativity. And we mentioned how they put in stadium seating with just wood cubes, and they created a cafe in one part of the room and beanbags in the other. And the superintendent was telling us how the students actually run to the classroom to get their favorite kind of seating. And it just shows you that the elements of choice and a little bit of an excited learning environment can really help support your blended learning program.
The furniture that we're using in the learning centers, it's a lot of furniture on wheels. That's as much as we can. We want our furnitures that are flexible and movable. The primary tool that we're looking at in the labs is tables, small tables where you can group 4 of them, because I think a group of 4 is optimal. Chairs that are easy to move. I saw something this morning where there's different heights. And what's nice about that is, from a supervision standpoint, you really can see what's going on. You've got, kids closer that are, at desk level, and it's almost like the perimeter is a whole nother, it's like an amphitheater feel.
I also love how Summit has evolved in this regard, Brian. If you went back last year when they were debuting this flex blended learning model in their San Jose school, what you saw is that the environment took place in what we call portable classrooms, basically temporary spaces that are sort of adjacent to the brick and mortar school building and are actually pretty popular in California. And what they realized was that they could remove some walls in these spaces that weren't load bearing, which allowed them to create much more open learning environments, but they were still a little boring and staid, and they evolved over the course of the year. And then, of course, this year you've seen in the footage how much more colorful and what sorts of design choices they've made to make that learning environment really come to life.
And this is that iterative idea that we've been talking about before, right? If you had seen Summit last year, you would have thought this might be the ugliest learning environment in California. And then you came back a few weeks later and it went from rows of tables to chairs to let's stagger where the rows are. And then they said, let's put in some higher seating. Let's put in some color. Let's put in a monitor on the wall. And over the course of literally 1 year, it went from being a room that you might have run from to being a place that you could really see being an effective learning environment. And they did that through feedback from their students, asking them what works for you and being bold and thinking about space very differently.
So student ownership matters.
Yep.
Space matters a lot in this work. And we knew that from the beginning, but we didn't know exactly how, and we didn't know what was going to make a difference. And so when we first set out to do this, we actually thought, if we tear down the walls and let kids sort of be in an open space and move, that would make a big difference. And so we did that, but then we didn't have enough resources or thought into the actual furniture. And so we ended up leasing this furniture that were these big long tables that were really hard to move, and essentially they became these giant rows that were dark and dingy in color, and it made the space feel very cavernous, and it actually set us back because the feeling in there was not consistent with our principles and our values of learning. And so we quickly had to iterate on that. And so we worked on how do we think about space, and we asked the kids that, and what we realized is we wanted space that was much more sort of collaborative in nature, much more comfortable, much more mobile, much more, and so what we ended up bringing in were a bunch of different trial pieces where we have a little cluster of chairs and a whiteboard here and more flexible.
So we know that this isn't a comprehensive look into how to redesign your school space for blended learning, but like everything in this course, the big message that Brian and I are trying to convey is throw away your existing assumptions about how this has to look, about how we have to have traditional classrooms and so forth, and instead really let the learning environment you're trying to create drive your design decisions. Don't compromise on that before you've actually asked that question, and figure out how much freedom you really have to shape this environment.